afternoon, everyone. So we've decided that we're going to do a bit of a tag team, and if we don't know the answer, we're going to take it to the floor. So we've got some questions. I'm going to hand it over to Cee.
Yeah, so as the young advocate in the room, I strongly believe that I should be learning where this all came from. A lot of the big events in advocacy history in Australia, I wasn't born yet. So I really wanted to take the opportunity to talk to Liz about some of those events that I missed and she didn't, and what their impacts were, because I firmly believe that I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, some of whom are in this room, and it's really fantastic to have this opportunity to have a chat. So first up, I wanted to ask you about some of the big milestones in disability advocacy, particularly some of those that the legislative milestones that we've mentioned might not have been so useful, but what were the good things that came out of those?
Thanks. Can you hear me? All good. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so from my perspective, I mean, there's been a whole heap of stuff that's happened in the Australian space in regards to advocacy and milestones. The first one was in 1908, and it was the Lunacy Act, but we're not going to talk about that too much. From then on, we went to the 1970s, and it was the start and the change of the disability landscape. It was where the conversations were starting from the medical model to the social model. And can I just remind everyone in the room that the NDIS conversation started in the 70s. So look how long it's taken. From there, we went to 1981, and the UN declared the International Year of Disabled People. And it marked a shift in social awareness of disability and a focus on fundamental human rights. In 1986, am I telling you things you don't know or you do know? Okay. So in 1986 was the birth of the Disability Services Act, where advocacy was funded for the first time as a fundamental and vital service offer. So going back that far. In 92, along came the Disability Discrimination Act to provide protection for all Australians against discrimination based on disability. And this was followed by a swag of subordinate legislation or standards. So that sort of might have gone back to some of the stuff that Jordan was talking about, you know, like how do we reinvigorate the standards for education, for transport, for access to premises. So I think that that's something we need to focus on. In 2008, Australia ratified and endorsed the United Nations, the Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities. And it's fundamentally a list of rights that guaranteed to people with disabilities to improve their access to an inclusive society, education and employment. In 2010 was the making of the National Disability Strategy. So the National Disability Strategy is really the operational arm of our reporting requirements to the United Nations. So I think that's an absolute biggie, but we've got a whole heap more to do. So for me, as far as where I come from and my journey, and I know most of them, they're probably the most important milestones.
Hello? Okay. So two that I'm very curious to start with are the Disability Discrimination Act and the Disability Services Act. I'm really curious about the positive impacts that those had. I feel like you might have noticed those. Sorry, Ross was signalling at me. The positive impacts you experienced in your lifetime.
In 1992, also the Disability Standards Act was a precursor for the DDA, and I think probably one of the most significant things that happened in that period of time was a fundamental shift in funding of service providers. So back in those days, service providers, I think it was called Section 5, then moved to Section 10 funding. And what that actually meant is that no one disability organisation could be responsible for a person's entire lifestyle. And I think that that's probably the biggest shift. It was, getting service providers to think differently and really empowering individuals and families and carers to make some of those choices, that choice and control that we talk about today. 92 also was instrumental. That's when buildings became accessible, apparently. Yeah? Yeah. So that was one of those amazing bits that came with it. So funding for service providers, it was a chance to look at service offer and to make choices in a real and meaningful way.
So the next one that I'm really curious to know about is one that I was alive for, which was the CRPD. So I remember learning about this in Year 8 as it was happening, which was that Australia contributed quite a bit to the advocacy around the CRPD. And I'm interested if you know much about the key players in that and what came out of it.
I could, but I would say that the people in this room were absolutely fundamental in the implementation and getting the CRPD. I know that Frank, who's sitting in the middle, was an absolute key contributor. Would anybody like to make any comment in regards to the CRPD? I know that Australia has done some magnificent work in the space and continues to do work in the space. Yeah, that would be amazing. Frank, would you?
And we have to be a little quick, Frank.
The CRPD has come about because of not only pressure from people with disabilities here in Australia, disability organisations, but worldwide, people with disabilities in their organisations. And it was at those UN meetings that they put pressure on their governments to actually begin to change things. And I might say that the original government that we went in under, the Australian government, was the Howard government, and they resisted the CRPD for quite a number of years. But it wasn't until other countries came on board with pressure from their people with disabilities within their own countries that eventually the Howard government decided that it was better to be seen to be on board than to be against it. So the upshot of the CRPD is the input from disabled people through their organisations and how crucial that is. And back in Australia, how crucial it was for us to get that through, but also to continue to put pressure on government to change things. If you're expecting others to do it, it won't happen. So we've all got to be involved.
Thanks, Frank.
So I think we might try to wrap it up with this last one, which is, I really want to know what you think the next generation needs to pull out of this, because learning from history is how we learn to do better and do more. And as Jordan said, there's a lot more to do, especially for young advocates like us.
Absolutely hit the nail on the head. I think if we can do anything as a sector, and being a vital and passionate sector is to grow our own, and we really need to embrace and take young people on the journey so that they can follow, and that we've got some succession within our community, being the disability community. That is probably the most vital thing that we can do.
Thank you, and I'll let you all get lunch now.
Thank you, Cee and Liz.